Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I am your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and this is the True Crime Interview Podcast. I realized I never say that in the intro. I think a true crime conversation speaks for itself, but you know what? It might not. So if you're new to the podcast, this is a weekly interview show where I talk to the most fascinating people in true crime and criminal justice. We talk about the genre of true crime itself, and we talk specifically about their work or point of view in the genre. So right now we're in an interesting series that I'm calling Rebecca Selects, which just means I'm selecting things that I love, am listening to, and am reading that I want to share with you, my listeners. And it's been a while since I've talked about cults, so we needed to get that back in on the roster. And I'm so glad to do it with today's guest. I spoke with Sarah Berman, a journalist and reporter from Canada. She lives in beautiful Vancouver, and she has reported extensively on your favorite cult and mine, or maybe just mine, NXIVM, for years.
So that's how I got into the NXIVM story. I met Sarah Edmondson. We did an on-camera interview in October 2017, so really on the heels of all that, and also on the heels of the Me Too movement. So that's also happening. And I was covering stories as well at that time, so I felt like I kind of had all these angles that I was interested in that weren't necessarily out there when it was a breaking story.
If you go to her website, which I'll link to in the show notes, you will see just a litany of articles she's written on NXIVM. I like to think I know a lot about this cult, and I do, but Sarah knows so much more. She knows so much she wrote a book on it. The book just came out in April. It's called Don't Call It a Cult, The Shocking Story of Keith Raniere and the Women of NXIVM. And you know I pre-ordered that thing, and I got it as soon as it came out, and I read it, and I contacted her, and I'm so happy to say she was receptive to talking with me. And so we really get into it because, again, her book is so extensive. I have not seen this kind of in-depth reporting on NXIVM anywhere else. If you think you know everything about NXIVM, I promise you, you don't. We go into lesser known aspects of the cult that I'm very curious about and fascinated by, including the three sisters from Mexico, Mariana, Daniela, and Camila, as well as some of the more senior members of NXIVM who were sort of part of this old school original founding days of NXIVM, including Barbara Jeske and Pam K. Fritz, and a weird conspiracy theory that is just that, not corroborated, around their kind of bizarre deaths. And if you want to go even more into the court case and the trial, which Sarah was able to attend in person in 2019 in New York, you're going to want to hear that conversation, which will be available later this week on my Patreon in my legal companion podcast called Trialogue, a courtroom conversation. So I teased out a lot of our court talk and put it over there. So with that, don't forget to check the show notes for more of Sarah's work, a link to this amazing book, and a link to Patreon as well. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Sarah Berman. Okay, Sarah, welcome to Dialogue Podcast. I am so excited to have you on and talk about your book, Don't Call It a Cult.
So good to be here.
Well, I'm always looking for people who want to talk about NXIVM as much as I do, and I think I might have found my match.
I can tell. It's amazing how much you've put into it already.
Well, when I started your book, I'm like, oh my gosh, you know so much more than me. Like, you've done the real deep dive, and I am really appreciating your book because I think a lot of people have come into the NXIVM story by way of documentaries. And if they're reading about it, they're going to be reading about it probably through a memoir of maybe a person in the cult. And your book is very different from that. So we're going to go there, but maybe we could just talk a little about your background as a reporter and a journalist, maybe what you were doing right before you started covering NXIVM, and then how you got to cover it at all.
Right. I started as just a reporter and editor with Vice, and I was general assignment, but looking back, it really looks like I did get drawn into crime-related stories. So I was writing about, drug prohibition in Canada before we legalized here in Canada, sex work that were sort of on this border, contested, and related stories. But I didn't think it was in any way my beat. But I did also get drawn to sort of weird subculture, and that was something very much encouraged at Vice. So I feel like you have these two kind of dynamics pushing me towards stories like this right up until the New York Times story. I feel like everyone sort of learned about NXIVM, at least the branding and blackmail aspects, from the New York Times in October 2017.
Yeah.
And I immediately started, Googling and Facebooking and realizing that, wow, I had all these connections on social media to folks who were pretty close, including many common friends with Sarah Edmondson, the main whistleblower. So that was mind-blowing to me. And I'm just really wanting to figure out how these people, who are very Vancouver-y in their political beliefs, they seem do-gooder in their sort of public image. How did they get drawn into something so bananas, so removed from the reality that I thought I was living? So that's how I got into the NXIVM story. I met Sarah Edmondson. We did an on-camera interview in October 2017. So really on the heels of all that, and also on the heels of the Me Too movement. So that's also happening. And I was covering stories as well at that time. So I felt like I kind of had all these angles that I was interested in that weren't necessarily out there when it was a breaking story. I kept at it. I mean, I couldn't help it because people were also still reaching out to me. There was not yet a criminal investigation, or at least there had been no arrests. And so the folks who were involved really wanted to get a spotlight on it so that the authorities would pay attention. And so I'd get all these weird calls. So that was my sort of entry to this. And I've since written about other cults, because once you pick up the sort of patterns, you do see it sort of apply across the board.
What other cults have come across your radar? Old ones or current ones?
More current ones, actually, which are even harder to crack because it's hard to weigh what's real and what's, not as real. But the one that's been on my mind quite a bit is the Twin Flames Universe cult.
Whoa, don't know it.
Yeah, well, that was one that I sort of broke, and there was a little bit of a blowback from the group. They tried to sue some of my sources. Thankfully, that got thrown out and withdrawn.
Wow.
But that was, it was a love and relationship type group. They espouse this, belief that everyone has this twin flame, and they coached people into doing some pretty intense things like violating restraining orders, for example, just showing the level of devotion to this group and the type of coaching they were receiving. And cutting off families, just a lot of the typical, and also health claims, really extravagant, like, oh, I cure cancer, kind of stuff. In the NXIVM context, they were also making extravagant health claims. They were also, claiming the leader was a genius, all these things. It's like, how does that even happen?
And is that Twin Flame group based in Canada or the States, or are they worldwide?
They're all over. So a lot of their stuff happens online. Mm-hmm. They're way more internet than NXIVM, but the couple are based in Michigan, and they had Canadians, they had people from Germany, all over.
So interesting. I feel like we could go into like bizarro, obscure cults, but let's focus on NXIVM. And let's start with the title of your book, which is Don't Call It a Cult. Now, I want to know, is that because you don't think we should? Is that because some of your sources were hesitant to call it that in the beginning? Or is it because that has nothing to do with their legal troubles, and none of them are being held in court on cult charges, right? They're criminal activity. So what's the title all about?
Right. So more of the latter. Obviously, this checks all the boxes. If you ask an expert, NXIVM has all the characteristics. So it is a little cheeky. It's also a reference to just all the misdirection and gaslighting that people experienced in NXIVM. Up was down, left was right. and NXIVM was definitely not a cult, right? This was something that they fought, they had such strong convictions about. It was not a cult. But yeah, when my first major interview, she was afraid to use the quote unquote C word on camera with me. And that was an upside down moment for me. I was like, what does this mean that she doesn't mind listing, the sashes, the interrupted sleep and diet? They called this guy Vanguard and bowed to a photo of him, all these sort of things. And by the way, branded with his initials. But I can't possibly go on record saying that this is a cult or I thought I was in a cult. Just like, what on earth, and it made me feel very skeptical about even just what she was telling me. I just didn't know what was going on. I had to do a little bit more research and figure out that, okay, they do have this history of going after people. There's this intense legal backlash. They were in fact trying to get charges put on Sarah's record just for helping people, get their credit card numbers off of their charge list, just trying to help them cancel their subscription. So I was only just on the edge of it, just sort of wading into it. And at the time, it just was an upside down moment, one of many to come.
Oh, I bet. As you're starting to cover the story, did you go into it going, this is a cult and I'm going to cover it, and maybe it's a criminal enterprise as well? Or were you pretty sure that it was criminal at the get-go?
To be honest, at the beginning, I had no idea what direction this would go. Even when there were charges, even when there were arrests, I was like, okay, but they have all this potential evidence of quote unquote consent. These videos of women saying, "Master, would you brand me? It would be an honor." It just did not seem clear to me what any outcome would be. It really was, weeks into the trial, after hearing all this evidence, all these witnesses just talking about the true nature, that any of this, that this was really, a ton of pressure being put on them, their families being held over their heads, their status in the United States being precarious and, again, held over their heads. And, just a lot of misdirection and, lack of transparency, just completely putting them in these really terrible positions. So after hearing a lot of that, and again, the testimony, because it was so wide-ranging and about people's feelings, it was hard to see where exactly the crime started and where it ended. These are not typical crimes. Of course, the defense, really jumped on that. They said, well, nobody was punched or stabbed, or, this wasn't a typical crime of passion, right? It was very calculated. And reason they thought maybe it would go in the defense's direction. But by the end, by the final weeks, everything lined up. There was so many patterns of coercion, and you could see how these, proof of consent pieces were staged, right? It was like the appearance of consent. Right. And it was Raniere, in his own words, thinking, I don't want it to look coerced. Like, you should ask to be branded, ask to be held down, and say, "Master, please brand me. It would be an honor for the rest of my life." So it was like, okay, I think, even if it's complicated, even if there's a lot of weird beliefs, people who still have beliefs that this was a good thing, it seems pretty straightforward what's actually going on.
Yeah, I remember early interviews with his lawyer, and he sounded so confident that this was going to be a little out of the box, and these are women and people who wanted an independent, kind of off the beaten path lifestyle, and that was going to be an okay narrative to push, and even like an anti-feminist story. Right. At one point he said, like, it's anti-feminist what we're doing here to these women, that, to take away that they chose this and wanted it, and if it were men, we would allow them to do it with no problem. And that really didn't go his way at all. And thankfully, the crimes did reveal themselves, and that's where, paperwork and following the money come in. So it was a blend of those things coming together.
Totally. Just a comment on the Agnifilo
Please.
saying, yeah, like, oh, you poor dears, we're not going to let you. And like, but if it was a Marine, they would let you do it. And that is, I believe, straight from Ranieri's mouth. I think he was directing his defense, and especially the opening statements quite a bit. And it takes only a little study of, sort of thought reform techniques or just cults in general to be like, while Marines get to join something that they know what it is, they serve a specific term, there's none of these other elements, like this was not the Army, God damn it. and
Right.
And also these women weren't into fetish. That was the other thing that, my background at Vice really like informed and drove me crazy, because everybody on the stand was like, I did not want to be put in a cage. I did not think that was cool. I did not want to own other people. These were not things that I was into and exploring about my sexuality. This was imposed on me, and there was blackmail material like making me do it. So that whole narrative, that whole getting out in front of the sort of distasteful aspects just really fell apart at trial.
Yeah, it's really infuriating. And I think it exposes too, I'm in true crime. And so there's a very good and important conversation happening around victim blaming. Like, we don't do that, right? We know better now when we're telling a story that no matter what that person did prior to their death, like none of it was their fault. So I feel like we're in this interesting territory with cults now, as we're getting more accustomed to the stories coming out, and especially in this one where nobody was being held against their will per se in a traditional locked door kind of way or gun to their head kind of way, that there can be some victim blaming and pushback against, even with collateral and these high stakes situations and coercion. Have you encountered people who are still reluctant to view women in NXIVM as victims?
Right. Well, I mean, there are some, loyalists, your Nikki Kleins of the world, who was part of DOS, part of this secret group that collected, collateral and all this, who do not believe that they are victims. I mean, they were trained in NXIVM not to be victims. So yes, even just on a like self-identifying level, there's lots of people who don't think there are victims here. And it is because the women sort of in the inner circle did know that it was Keith at the top. They weren't deceived like some of the women who testified, like Nicole or some of the other victims. I think there is a gray area because you do have people who are exhibiting very confusing decision making. I mean, you say gun to your head. There is, in a sense, the blackmail being like a gun to your head.
Yeah, it serves as that. Yeah.
Because it's sort of this pressure that, their life could be entirely destroyed if they don't sort of go along and stay in line. I think some ambiguity is okay too. Like, it's okay for people to have different ideas about what a victim or a survivor is and, who applies. I definitely don't stand for anybody who's, sort of calling these folks out as stupid or weak-willed. I just don't think that's applied. Like, I just don't think that's true. These were extremely smart and capable women. But they did get led down this really intense path. And some of them had more agency in it than others.
I want to get back to Nikki Klein and kind of the people maintaining support. But before that, I want to be the first to admit at a certain time of my life, I'm probably a little too old now, but I would have said yes to an invitation to something, and I don't know if I would have gone all in hook, line, and sinker, but I absolutely would have said yes. And I think you have an interesting part of your book where you ask Sarah to kind of go through a bit of an experience could you talk about what you asked her to do with you to kind of replicate what she might do when recruiting people to Executive Success Program into NXIVM?
Yeah, so Sarah Edmondson was one of the top recruiters, and she actually had her own sort of recruiting kind of scheme, and it was a much more soft touch than some of the other recruiters in NXIVM. So she walked me through that as if she was pitching me on this life-changing opportunity. And so we went on this walk. It was really friendly. She really talked me up. We were getting really close. And it was very gentle. She asked me to imagine sort of a blue sky where I'd worked on all my sort of deficiencies and patterns and had actually achieved what I wanted to and felt really good about it and I wasn't second guessing myself. I felt good doing that. She actually made it comfortable. And then she sort of asked, well, how much do you think those patterns that you identified cost you? She asked me to put a literal dollar figure on it. And I'm like, what? It sort of came out of nowhere because you've, had such a comfortable time. You sort of want to go along with it. So I picked a number out of the air and she sort of says, well, great, our program's only $3,000. So the hard pitch sort of came out of nowhere. And she recruited some 2,000 people this way, stripping down, that happened in the intensives for most people, right? So they would take the introductory course and they would be told, you really need to work on this. You're never going to be the best at what you do if you don't work on these inner deficiencies or what have you. Or you're wanting to sound smart is really holding you back. You have to really take feedback and not resist it. And so that's how they kind of get you in this, like I'm really wrong and I need to listen to everything they say. That comes later down the road. But yeah, it was really important for me to see what it looked like from the ground, someone just encountering a nice, successful actress who's got a bunch of really cool friends and wants to invite you. And it sounds almost like, a cool party more than it sounds like something that's going to just strip you of your personality and become sort of a living hell. Because I also thought this could potentially happen to me if I was in a time of transition. This could potentially be a best friend of mine pulled in. Because there were people just sort of in my cohort of, extended acquaintances, people who had went to high school, for example, with Nikki Klein. And so, yeah, I definitely didn't want to do the dismissive thing. I wanted to see what it looked like from the inside.
Yeah, I think that's so important. You're touching on two things. And one is that this is such a gradual process, and that initial saying yes leads to something else, which led to something else. And this goes for most cults. You don't sign on a dotted line, like I'm joining a cult, sign me up and here's my life and money. It's just not how it works. Most people wouldn't fall for that. So there's such a slow grooming and breaking down process. And also cults tailor their messaging to people that will be receptive towards it. So she's very good at that. Sarah's very good at that and kind of spoke to you in a way that captivated you, but also they know their audience. I mean, that's why NXIVM was comprised of so many sort of similar types of people, because they were kind of creatives and they were successful and they were into wanting to make the world better and themselves better. I wouldn't have joined Heaven's Gate because I don't know about UFOs. It doesn't interest me. But that's why NXIVM would have been more my thing, because I want to be better and I want to make the world better. So it's all of sort of a cult's MO as well, is tailoring that message for the right person. What I appreciated about your book is, the branding story, it is so wild, and it obviously has a lot of sensational, even though it's true. Documentaries focused on it, and we obviously all glommed onto that story, but there's a lot of other parts to NXIVM that I find equally, if not more, disturbing. And it's not even, who cares? We don't have to rate them. They're all pretty bananas, as you said. It is not a competition, but I'm really glad you spent time on the sisters from Mexico, specifically Daniela's story, who was captive in a room for nearly 2 years, and her younger sisters grooming Camila. So could you talk about, there's really 3 sisters, and their role in NXIVM, and maybe even how roots of NXIVM began and were established in Mexico, if you know?
The connections through Mexico happened through Edgar Boone. He was the first to sort of break in. He was already a personal development guy in Mexico, and he was from a very wealthy family. And he was the one that sort of roped in the sons of presidents and all this. So he had a very wealthy, well-to-do network. And he opened a center in Monterrey, which was where Daniela's family started in the early 2000s. So this is almost 20 years ago now. She was top of her class, had dreams of Harvard, and was only 16 years old, by the way, was just going to high school. And she got this from her dad to do an intensive in Monterey. And she was immediately sort of focused on. In NXIVM, there was so much selection that went on. So if somebody's having a really exciting time, they're really getting the concepts, they get love bombed, essentially, right? And for Daniela, it was the hopey, changey stuff that really drew her in. And she wanted to change the world. She wanted to save the whales. And NXIVM was telling her that she couldn't do any of those things unless she worked on her disintegrations. And it's so interesting that, it just sort of puts NXIVM at the top priority list. No matter what you like, no matter what you want to do in the world, NXIVM is the way to do it. And so at 16, that appealed to her. And she was moving on to a different city anyways. So she decided to take a, quote, sabbatical and join the real world mission. And thus starts, her family sort of being manipulated and torn apart in all these horrible ways. And because she was undocumented in the United States, she suffered some of the worst treatment at trial. Because she was subjected to some of the worst treatment, Raniere was just so much more sensitive about her getting out. So he was, exercising the worst types of control over her because she didn't want, or sort of revealing his deepest, darkest secrets. They're thankfully protected, actually, their identities by court order, because Camilla was sexually exploited as a 15-year-old when she first came to Albany. And so, they've left out of the major podcast and documentary stories. So it was important for me to, during the trial, really highlight their stories and how they were talked to also by Raniere. Like, aside from the crimes, it was just such a gut punch to just see how they were treated by Raniere. So I definitely wanted to bring that dynamic to light because they are sort of the center of the legal case, right? This criminal trial would not have happened were it not for Daniela testifying like she did. And a brilliant teller of her own story. Like, she deserves a documentary to herself if she wanted it, but I know she does want privacy. And
understandable. And so surprising in reading your book that I didn't realize was that during Daniela's captivity, her parents were local to Albany or Clifton Park. I don't know if they were in the house or in a different house.
It was the same house. So
it was the same house.
Yeah. Well, and so they're also being kept in line with some form of blackmail and manipulation. That's the thing, is anyone who was closely working with Keith Raniere had to have given over some kind of information or secret that would have been very damning to them personally. So, for example, Keith Raniere was always joking about how their father, Hector, might have been gay. And there just seems to be these hints that, he had information that would be embarrassing to all of them. And that did have an effect on their psychology. They might not have openly been like, he's blackmailing me, but they internalized that power that he had over them and they acted sort of accordingly. That's just one of the sort of speculative theories that you have, because it doesn't make sense for a family to sort of enforce this kind of thing. But then on the other hand, they were led to be convinced that their daughter had done something really grave, like was compared to killing a child with a car,
Brush is an electric toothbrush that will change the way you think about brushing your teeth. With powerful sonic technology and ultra gentle bristles, the Brush redefines what it means to have super clean teeth. It's like that feeling when you just leave the dentist, a fresh, whole mouth clean every single day. And those ultra gentle bristles, that is for me. My dentist always asks me, what did your gums ever do to you? Apparently, I am damaging them by the way I brush so aggressively. So I am very excited to get my Brush. And you can get yours too. Dialogue listeners are going to get 15% off their total purchase with the code POD15. That's POD15. Follow the link in the show notes, enter the code POD15 to get your exclusive discount and upgrade your oral care routine with Bruche. Right. And for people who don't know the story, maybe could you just briefly set it up a little bit? It is as wild as what you just said, but yes.
Yeah. So basically, because Danielle's relationship with Keith Raniere was completely under wraps and she was not allowed to talk about it, they had to come up with some other reason why, Daniela had some ethical breach that she absolutely needed to heal with Keith before she could do anything else in her life. And so in this conversation between Keith Raniere and her mom, who's not a native English speaker, he's starting to explain that, what Daniela has done is as grave as hitting a toddler with a car. And her older sister, Mariana, is translating. And I'm not sure it fully translated that this was an analogy, or if she truly thought her daughter had secretly covered up an actual accident involving a toddler. It just wasn't clear what was going on in that scene. And we heard that recording in court, and it was just another moment where you shake your head and you're like, yeah, the reality each of these individual people was living in was so different and so like an emergency situation every day this Raniere guy wanted them to be in.
And so they then supported Keith's idea for her punishment, which was to stay in a bedroom.
Right. So that meant, a mat on the floor, no books, no music, just a pen and paper. And the only person she could interact with was Lauren Salzman, who was sort of overseeing this program, and Keith Raniere. And she could not see her family. They would not talk to her, even though they were, living in the same house.
That is the hardest part for me to get my head around. I have to tell you, I would never blame victims, and maybe you would consider her family victims in this. It's very hard for me to relate as a parent to allowing that to go on for nearly 2 years. She's in there.
At a certain point, you do have to let it stay unexplainable. I could do all I can to sort of show the mentality and show, all the layers of deception that sort of went into it. But I don't want to get into justification territory where I'm just over explaining, because it really is, just inconceivable. And at a certain point, it's well, that's okay. This is a really out there sort of example. I mean, it can just be left as really unbelievable because it is.
Yeah, I'm just so glad so you got to see her in court. I'm so glad she survived this. So her testimony was where the sex trafficking charges stem from, right? With her and her sister. Is that where a lot of that?
She was more trafficked for her labor, actually. So he was getting her to do all these tasks, and the racketeering charges also, that was one of the big ones, was Daniela. But the sex trafficking was actually the DOS scheme. So you had witnesses who were initiated into DOS testifying about the sex trafficking and attempted sex trafficking. But yes, Daniela was, found to be trafficked.
Okay. And full of weird twists and turns and bizarro things. What did you encounter? What was the most surprising? And it might be something we've already discussed, but when it was revealed to you in your investigation and reporting that you were like, oh my gosh, almost unbelievable.
Well, I guess the thing that I didn't have corroborated at all before the trial was Keith Raniere's relationship with Camilla. So I had people who knew about Daniela, they knew about Mariana, her older sister, but the private relationship between Camilla and Raniere, that was a bit of a black hole for me. And so during the trial, when they actually read out the WhatsApp messages between them and the way that he talked to her was just so shocking to me. It really, had a physical effect on me that lasted a few days. It was just this alternate reality, and she wasn't given an inch. Like, she wasn't given any autonomy whatsoever, any ability to sort of structure her own life. And it really was through sort of brute psychological force, if that makes sense. It was just repeated to her again and again until she finally sort of relented. And you had all this sort of relenting. Anytime she had any emotion about being deceived, she was told, you need to work on that. You have to get back in line, basically. And so I think that was the piece that sort of brought the case together, like it just one of many sort of upside down moments, just trying to catch your breath, following like what has been happening this whole time, like this is what he's done with his most closely guarded relationship. There's just so much that people who are really close to this group just didn't know that whole time.
Yeah, so much darker than people even realized. And I think what was so surprising in reading your book that I didn't realize was that during Daniela's captivity, her parents were local to Albany or Clifton Park. It takes a lot of courage to go back there. Two women I want to talk about, Pam Kafritz and Barbara Jeske, also names that I don't think are as top of mind for people. Can you talk a little bit about each of them and their role? And I know that's hard, deaths, because I think this is interesting.
Right. So this is more the sort of early generation of Inner Circle. So even though they seem sort of far removed from the DOS, sort of thing, I think they were doing the same kind of procuring work for Keith in the early days, like even before NXIVM existed. He had this other scheme called Consumers Byline, which was an MLM that ripped a bunch of people off. They were operators in that. And they became top senior counselors in NXIVM really quickly. And so they're doing a couple things. They're keeping all of the other girlfriends sort of in line. So they're basically making visits, kind of making sure that people are working on their issues. And usually that meant, not leaving, having to resolve their conflicts if they had them with Keith, and really staying on their, program of whatever kind. They were senior coaches to a lot of people. So even the sort of lower level folks who were just getting introduced, if they were important to Keith's objectives, then someone like Pam Kafritz or Barbara Jeske would be their coach. So Sarah Edmondson's coach was Barbara Jeske. She was a top recruiter, and that was sort of like a pretty close line into the sort of nucleus of this.
Yeah.
I would say kind of spies too. So they would participate in all these intensives, they would participate in the breakout groups, and they would report back to Keith whatever they heard that was sort of useful information. And somebody who was just, attending for the first time, they wouldn't clock that right away. They don't know who's who. They might see, the different colored sash, so they're high ranking, but they don't realize that, yeah, this whole operation was sort of powered by secret information. But yeah, and then Pam Kafritz was definitely a procurer of the young women and girls. So she would often facilitate his sexual relationships. So she initiated the relationship with Lauren Salzman, who's the co-founder's daughter, when she's just in her early 20s. Yeah, just most of the sort of women who had secret relationships with Keith, they were first sort of groomed and mentored by Pam, and then, sort of pitched on this, beautiful way to explore their sexuality. So super fascinating. That's also how Mariana became involved with Keith.
Did Barbara and Pam both die of cancer?
Yes, Karen Antrainer, one of the folks who was sort of in a similar Inner Circle role, she actually went to college with Keith, had her hair tested and found some, pretty intense chemicals, like something close to rat poison, I'm not sure. And so, yes, and this was first brought up to me actually by Sarah Edmondson, I want to say in like May 2018. She was like, oh yeah, I think they were poisoning them, trying to get rid of sort of the old generation. and, allegedly usher in the sort of younger women to replace them. And you did have, that even on the eve of Pam's sort of memorial, Keith is giddy about the new branding ceremonies that are about to happen. And it's just a really weird circumstantial situation to be, in public saying how bare he is over the loss of his one life partner, and then suddenly just being, just really excited about some really dark stuff. So yeah, that is definitely a theory that is out there. It was presented to me. It was not something that I could substantially prove to include in the book. And so I don't, take with whatever grain of salt. But yes, this is an established theory that some of the women, who are part of NXIVM are worried about.
Don't you think with the FBI investigation and all the focus and all the scouring they did, that if there was any rumbling about that there'd probably be a criminal investigation around it? Or maybe there could be ongoing.
I think the authorities are more worried about the tax evasion, like more the organizational stuff. That sort of interest in the poisoning allegation has certainly faded. I know that when that documentary came out, there was some interest even among the people who were involved.
Sure.
I think Sarah Edmondson even secretly alludes to it in her book.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's some kind of offhanded reference to folks getting really sick, and was there something in the water, something like this thing. But yeah, I don't know. I just don't know what police are up to and what their priorities are.
Right. Well, I would hope that if there was any credible evidence to suggest it, that it would be a little bit on their priority list to see if those deaths were, natural or caused by cancer or forced by, the growth of cancer somebody gave them. Did you speak with still supporters of Keith Raniere's?
Mostly not on the record, but yeah, I did have a couple sort of phone conversations and text exchanges with the loyalists. Some of them were completely silent the whole time, and I get that too. You also are worried about credibility. In a case where someone has proven they are willing to lie and, to sort of put forward one cause, it's an iffy prospect as a journalist to even include those voices. Because Allison Mack, she lied to the New York Times Magazine, right? Like, she said the branding was her idea, and that just was not true. We learned, during testimony. So that was also a factor in obviously I reached out to everybody. I, tried to get a response from everybody. But even if we did move forward with including their perspectives, it would come with those sort of questions about, like, whether it's okay to include when you're not sure about the credibility.
I was shocked to learn that there were people still willing to publicly declare loyalty to NXIVM, and I was shocked when Dateline did an episode on it and had Nikki Klein and Danielle the doctor on.
Mm-hmm.
And they set it up that you didn't, I for sure thought Danielle the doctor was coming on to kind of express her remorse, and not at all. I was like, wow, because, everything else aside, criminally, just as a doctor, it felt like an ethical violation of her oath to protect patients. And I just thought it was really interesting that she was still talking about, I think her justification was a difference between harm and pain, or she had a very interesting kind of like very NXIVM-y explanation for it.
Totally. I mean, and that's the thing, is there was always it's for the greater good explanation for absolutely everything. So everything was for people's personal growth. And anybody who backed out, it wasn't because they were like, wait, this wasn't what I signed up for. It was because they just were weak. They couldn't handle, the growth that was required of them. So yeah, they're at a point where, again, a lot of them have just so much kind of blackmail and, other sort of factors keeping them in line that they can't think of leaving without thinking about their life being utterly destroyed. So it's almost a path of least resistance, even though there's so much support for leaving, like all the people that they, allegedly hurt are ready with open arms to sort of accept them if they leave. But it just, that would also include having to accept that they were wrong and accept like a whole lot of sort of harmful things did happen. And I just think, some of them just aren't ready for that.
They're not ready. Yeah. Oh, it's going to be so brutal if they ever have that reckoning. It's the longer and the more time that goes by. I just think it's going to be tough.
It is going to be tough. Yeah. Sarah Edmondson, she's sort of like, can you send this to Nikki? Like, Nikki really needs to hear this one or whatever. And she's sort of trying to communicate through the media sometimes.
Yeah.
Because there's no reaching, it's really hard to reach somebody who's isolated themselves into a very specific echo chamber.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just talk about, which is the idea of victim and perpetrator and the blurry lines that can happen with cults, where maybe you became a member and then you were sort of victim, in this case to Keith Raniere, but then in an Allison Mack figure, I think she embodies that kind of quandary. So how do you view her? What is your perception there? Where does that kind of personally situate you on your thoughts about her actions?
A great question, and one I think I'll still have different answers to. Like, ask me in 6 months, I'll probably think something different. I think definitely there is a blend and then some, right? Like, she's definitely been a victim along the way and has perpetrated against others. No question. Like, the scheme is like at fault ultimately, like the construction of the scheme was really what made so much suffering happen. It was calculated and, again, just on a mass scale. So that's a worse crime than being badly, badly deceived and again, under some amount of threat, carrying out these awful abuses. So I think look at it in a multidimensional way and sort of try to see both of those at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would, for her, I would hope for a far less sentence, and I would hope for some, our American criminal justice system isn't great at consequences that might help and improve a person's life in the time after they serve their time. So, has a responsibility to pay for it. And then I think she really is going to need a lot of help, because I think she has, a lot of life ahead of her. And I don't know that this should completely ruin all opportunity for her life.
It's so interesting too, because she some courses, I believe, at Berkeley on gender and whatnot. I don't know if you've heard about this.
No.
And she was outed by other students. Like, I guess she was pretty talkative in class, and people were like, I'm not comfortable discussing gender, sex, and power with Allison Mack,
That's a fair point.
So I think she was asked to leave. But then on that point, I'm like, you know what? I think Allison Mack needs those courses. Maybe she doesn't need to speak up in them. Maybe she can just get a recording. But I think she should connect with, the actual ideas in politics that she was interested in from the beginning. But the academic side of it, not the Keith Raniere,
agreed,
thought reform aspect of it. So you can find those stories. That was one that I skipped out on reporting on, because I just, I don't know, despite everything she's done and, has taken responsibility for, I just couldn't bring myself to be like, Allison Mack, get out of Berkeley or whatever it was.
Yeah, no, that doesn't seem entirely fair either. But I do understand a student being like, well, that's uncomfortable for me, given what I know you did or are accused of doing. Maybe she could audit and not be a participant like you said.
I feel like there's a solution here.
Absolutely. Well, for anybody who wants a serious deep dive into NXIVM, its origins, its evolution, and all the main players in it, your book is just really fantastic. I'd just been kind of craving something that really went deeper than the stories I'd already heard and seen. So, well done. I can't see what you're doing next, which Was there anything you're working on that you could even maybe tease a little bit?
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm just digging into another Canadian trial, and I think it does have an international appeal, but it's a 5-part podcast we're going to do with CBC. More details to be revealed.
Oh, very cool. Are you on board as a host or researcher or both?
At the moment, producer and possible host. We're just at the outset, so we've got at least 5 months of work ahead of us. So ask me again in the fall and I'll be able to update you.
I'm such a fan of their podcasts, so I will. And before I let you go, I ask all my guests before they go, what gets you up in the morning?
Oh my goodness. I guess it's just a new question every day.
I love that.
Yeah. I get big questions going in my brain and I can't let them go. I wake up just trying to solve them. That's a great way to start the day. I love it. Sarah, thank you so much for killing the small talk and being on Dialogue. Amazing. Thanks, Rebecca. Great to be here.
Dialogue is a Yellowtape media production edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.